Well, it's really great to actually be in SAMS, getting to give a talk about some of the work I do. I spend so much time in the waters in the Firth of Lorne and Loch, dipping in and out with various colleagues at SAMS, such as Stephen, that to actually get to come here and talk about my work is actually a real privilege. I'm quite excited to get a chance to do so. What I'm going to talk to you today about, it's a bit of a timeline piece about the marine protected area that you have on your doorstep in the Firth of Lorne, which is designated for the flapper skate. There's been decades worth of work that's gone into this MPA and its designation, so I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of the historical background, as well as introduce you obviously to its main attraction, the flapper skate. And then when we've gone through the work to get got the MPA to the status it's in today, I'm going to discuss with you a little bit about the monitoring work that we're currently undertaking as part of a much wider project with lots of collaborators. So, to introduce the skate, it's had quite a complicated timeline, the common skate or the flapper skate. It's the same species. It was called the common skate because at once upon a time, about 100 years ago, it was ubiquitous all around the UK coastline. You could find it anywhere. Over the last century, however, this is one of the first cases of a marine species being declared locally extinct. It was extirpated from much of its former range, the Irish Sea, the North Sea. It was no longer found in the survey trawls. It was commonly caught as a... missed a slide there, sorry. It was commonly caught as a bycatch species in a targeted fishery. And just to add confusion to the mix, in 2010 somebody did some genetics work on it, Iglesias et al. And what was formerly called the common skate, Dictyrus batus, was then split into two subspecies, the flapper skate, intermedius, and the blue skate, which is flossada. And there's some geographic separation of these two, some life history differences. The flapper skate, which we get in our protected area and around Scottish waters, is much larger. It's the larger of the two. While the blue skate is slightly smaller, and it's a more southerly range in its distribution. In common with all elasmobranch species, the flapper skate has a typically K strategist life history. It's very late to mature. The females mature at about 14 years old, 14 to 15 years old. It has low fecundity, perhaps only 30 pups over the course of 2 years. When these pups hatch from the egg cases, they're very large and well developed. This picture here would only be about 2 months old, and you can see immediately as soon as that hatches from the egg case, it's vulnerable to getting by-caught in fishing gear. This does tend to mean that elasmobranchs as a whole, the sharks, skates and rays, are very slow to recover. If the population experiences any decline, it takes a long time for them to rebuild the numbers. They've got a very low rebound potential. Now this is important when you get these huge fishery markets. This is, the last 100 years, hundreds and thousands of skates being caught. They were traditionally quite a low value product, but they were still caught regularly through commercial fisheries. And, we can't just pick on the commercial guys. There was a strong recreational angling interest in these species as one of the largest fish you can catch in UK waters. And to get the trophy record, to get the weight, you had to bring the animal back to the dockside to get officially weighed and measured. And all throughout Ireland, Shetland, around the coast of Scotland, the flapper skate, as we now know it, or the common skate back then, was regularly caught and brought back to the dockside to be measured. Largest specimen has been about 230 pounds. They grow up to about 3 meters long, 2 meters wide, so they are massive animals, as you can see from the pictures. All this has led to a massive population decline. If we take that localized extinction, the declining in landings, and we have to have some form of management. The population needs to be managed appropriately to ensure that we can get that population recovery. Currently, it's a total zero catch allowance as a prohibited species, so the emphasis on any commercial bycatch of this species. The skate has to be returned in as good a condition as possible and as quickly as possible. But other than that, as a fisheries management, we can't stop them being taken as bycatch, and commercial fishermen aren't always too gentle with these animals. We do have cases where we find skate with docked tails. 100-kilo animal is quite tricky to return back to the environment if you're not expecting it. So one of the methods they use is to wrap a rope around the tail, winch it up and then cut the rope off, leaving it attached to the skate. Unfortunately, this tourniquets the animal and the tail drops off. Another method is to cut 2 handles in the cheek, and they literally lift it up and return the animal, and these scars are healing. They do survive it, but the knock-on in terms of what this means to their life history, are they still able to reproduce, do they recover fully from the stress of those events, we don't know. Another management method we have is, of course, marine protected areas. Just to look at marine protected areas briefly, it's obviously a static form of management, and a designated area of the ocean has a specific management regime within it. In terms of mobile species, though, their use is maybe questionable a little bit. They do tend to only protect one life history stage and one sex at a time. And for the general consensus is that they're most suitable for critical life history stages with special focus on nursery areas. This is taken from teleost fish management, where these mass spawning events obviously produce millions of eggs, and protecting the area where the fish are doing it is obviously an important point of that population's life history cycle to protect in order to maximise recruitment to the populations. The problem is, if we take that logic and apply it to the elasma banks, as has been done, we have potentially a bit of an issue. So we have a nice coastal inlet, which might be a typical skate or a shark nursery ground. We can draw a line across the mouth of that, a nice simple marine protected area, and we have protection. The problem is with many of these species, large, high mobile potential, is their home range increases with age. And they leave that protection of the zone, and they can be taken as bycatch. Even if they return, the event of being taken as a bycatch species still occurs. And if we add to that the late maturity of many sharks, such as the skate, we have a position where there's actually no recruitment because there's no animals going back to the nursery ground to reproduce. This happened in Australia with a species of shark called taupe. It was the first documented marine protected area for any elasmobranch in the world. They protected all these embayments and estuaries, and within 10 years the population had totally collapsed because we had exactly this situation. So that calls into question, can we use static management for an animal that's highly mobile? And there's one last piece to the puzzle of marine protected areas, which is identifying potential behaviours such as site fidelity or residency that might actually allow us to protect these animals in their maturing or adult stages where they spend a disproportionate amount of time. So if we go back to our nursery area, the animal leaves, but it has site fidelity to the embayment and it returns repeatedly, so it benefits from protection time after time throughout its life history. And that means that all of a sudden that marine protected area has become much more beneficial to the protected species at various stages throughout its life history. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking to identify these kind of behaviours so that we can then use static management to manage what we classically call a mobile species. And then, of course, we get recruitment, the population hopefully recovers, and all's well in the world. Problem is, we need to be able to identify these movement patterns. We need to understand where this residential or site fidelity behaviour is occurring, the nature of it, the timing of it, and to do that in a species that never comes to the surface can obviously be quite challenging. We have a number of tools at our disposal. The one I'm going to talk to you about today, this is the work I undertake. It's tagging work of these animals. There's various different types, conventional ID tags, acoustic tags, archival tags, all of which I will talk about in a little more detail throughout the talk. And we also have satellite tags as well. But again, for the species I work with, unlike a basking shark that spends a lot of time swimming through surface waters with its dorsal fin out, as far as we know, these animals have never come to the surface. We've tried GPS tags and we've had a 100% failure rate. So we don't tend to use those anymore. Okay, so to go right back to the simplest form of tagging, and also, as it happens, the beginning of the whole tagging work on the flapper skate, we have the Scottish Shark Tagging Programme. This is a citizen science-led project run by anglers. Anglers are going out and catching and releasing these animals on a regular basis, as I alluded to earlier. It's one of the biggest species of fish that you catch in our waters, and despite the fact they're incredibly dull to catch for any anglers out there, it is literally like winching up a fridge from 200 metres down. They love the trophy shot. They love the picture of themselves kneeling on the deck of the boat with 100 kilos of fish. Luckily, they tend to look after them quite well and return them. And to make the most of that, they started applying ID tags. This assigned an individual identification number to an animal so they could get a rough idea of if it was recaptured, how much it had grown, and maybe where it had moved to. I would just like to introduce a gentleman called Dr. Dietrich Buerkle, who we sadly lost about 5 years ago. He started the tagging of the common skate in the 1970s. This is a data set that's been running for nearly 50 years now. Dr. Dietrich was a German professor who came to Scotland regularly to enjoy his fishing trips around the island of Mull. And he just fell in love with the species that he was catching, and the fact that there was no data on them troubled him. So he started applying the tags, and he initially built up the Glasgow Museum's tagging programme, which then turned into the Scottish Shark tagging programme. This is the kind of data that we get back. I've obviously focused in the Sound of Mull, the Firth of Lorne and the Crinan area. So far we have 3,000 or over 3,000 skate tagged. Now I don't know if many of you work with recapture data, but globally speaking, when we're looking at recapture studies, you tend to see recapture rates of maybe 5% and you're quite happy, maybe 10% you've had an exceptional study. We have a recapture rate in the Firth of Lorne of over 30%. That's a third of the animals tagged get recaptured. And all, except about 5, have all been recaptured in the area where they originally tagged, which is this area either out off Mull, out of Tobermory, in the Sound of Mull and the Firth of Lorne. This is the historical data set. In more recent times, people have started tagging to the south in the Sound of Jura, just off Crinan. But this is the historical data. So this is the accumulation of about 30 years worth of tagging, since 1970 to about 2000. Now, the Scottish Sea Angling Conservation Network, who run the Scottish Shark tagging programme, saw this data, saw that animals were repeatedly getting caught in the Firth of Lorne, suggesting that animals were making repeated use, some sort of site fidelity behaviour. And on the back of this data, they put in a proposal in 2010, 2011 for the area to be a marine protected area, a nature conservation marine protected area for this species of skate. They put in actually a very strong proposal. The problem was, and the big problem with marking recapture data is you put the tag out, you recapture the animal, great, but we have no idea on what that animal has done in the meantime. So we have no idea on the strength of this residency, the strength of site fidelity. So Marine Scotland looked at the proposal, looked at a few gaps, and they actually did some further research. So this is the proposed area, which looks very similar to the current border boundaries of the protected area that Sasakan proposed. But they asked for protection to run all the way down into the Sound of Jura, which is where a few tags had begun to be deployed in the early 2000s. So Marine Scotland looked at that mark and recapture data to try and get ideas of population size, to try and get ideas of transient versus resident fish. And they came up with a few figures. Now, there are huge problems with external mark and recapture tags, especially when you have people who want to disrupt the efforts to protect something. Believe it or not, some of the anglers do. They were catching fish and pulling the tags out. And the tags also shed, so that immediately pushes up estimates of mortality, immediately pushes up estimates of transient fish, because there's fish that are tagged that are never seen again. But we had population estimates of hovering around the 400 mark, even despite this tag removal, this tag shedding. We had a strong suggestion that many of the tagged individuals were resident or had site fidelity, and only about a third of them were transient. But to bolster this a little further, they looked to the south of the MPA and they deployed acoustic tags. Just to quickly explain what acoustic tags are, these are individual transmitter tags that constantly transmit an acoustic code, which gives you an individual identification number, and you put a series or a network of hydrophones in the water that communicate specifically with the tag. So they don't record background noise, they only record the presence of a tag. So when a tag's approximately 500 meters away from a receiver unit, you'll get a date timestamp and an identification code to suggest that that animal was in the area. So they put out a relatively small array, but this is a detection plot where we have the identification of the skate on the Y, and we have the time from October 2011 to October 2012, a full year. Split into sex, with the reds being females and the blues being males. And we can see there are some cases of high residency with animals spending a large proportion of their time near this acoustic array. 4 receivers just in this deep water trough, just at the head of the Sound of Jura there. So that's a relatively small area for one animal to be spending all this time with very little breaks in its residency. The males showed much more seasonality. Over winter they seemed to be present in these waters, and then over summer they seemed to disappear, but we did have some detections suggesting they came back again. This data, along with the marker and recapture data and the proposal, led to the designation of this protected area in 2014. In a wider context, globally, marine protected areas for elasma banks are quite rare, especially on a relatively small scale in coastal waters, but in the UK it's unique. This is currently the only protected area for a shark, skate or a ray species, an elasma bank species, in UK waters. There's another one proposed for the Sea of the Hebrides for basking sharks between Tiree and Col, which is shown to be a hotspot, but that's still in the process of designation. So, taking in mind that this is a citizen science project, this is members of the public tagging that has led to this protection with the scientists feeding in. For me, this is a real success story of multi-stakeholder involvement, engagement, all working together towards the same aim. And that's the end of one part of the story, and then we move on to the next, because brilliant, we have a marine protected area. We now need to understand if it's working, how it's working, and how the animals are using it, which I'm obviously delighted to, because this has meant I've had a job for the last few years. So in 2016 to 2017, we undertook a very concerted effort to really try and understand how the skate were using the protected area, the habitat use, the residency, the population size. And to do this, we undertook a relatively large-scale tagging program. We stuck to acoustic tags after the success in the crinoid area, but this time we also included archival tags. So if you can imagine, I've got a network of acoustic receivers all listening approximately 500 meters. The big problem with that is, in an area that's 720 square kilometers, the current area of the MPA, you're going to have gaps. So to try and understand what the skate were doing in those gaps, archival tags were fitted. Now, archival tags constantly record environmental parameters. I'll discuss the ones that we used in just a couple of slides, but overall we had 43 skate that had both types of tag. And we put receivers out in the area for 14 months. Just a quick video of a skate being released, if it will work. This for us is a kind of surety value that the tagging work we're doing is really having a minimum impact. Animal welfare, you know, we're working with a critically endangered species in an area that's designated for its protection, so the welfare of that animal is paramount to us. There's no point in doing our work if we're detrimental to the animal's health. So we monitor the release and obviously the subsequent behaviour of every single animal, and we're constantly refining the techniques to make sure that we are impacting the species as little as possible. I'll happily talk to people if they're interested about tagging techniques, tagging procedures at some point, but to cover all of that and the history of the MPA work would have been much too long a talk for an afternoon session, I'm afraid. So we had 45 acoustic receivers throughout the Firth of Lorne and up into the Sound and Mull. This is a video of all detections. So each blip is a receiver unit, with the reds being females and the blues, which don't show up as well on this, being the males. And this is just going through the whole year of deployment. So at the moment we're in July, we can see lots of activity just off the Isle of Mull, between Mull and South Kerrera. Mostly females at the moment. And then in October time we begin to see more blue circles, more males coming back into the area from where they were tagged. And then, as we progress into December, we can actually see a movement into this upper area just off the south of Lismore at the entrance to the Sound and Mull, suggesting some seasonality even within a relatively small geographic area. To sort of summarise this, we tagged the animals where the yellow dots are. The acoustic receivers, the size of the circle represents the number of detections each individual receiver got over the course of a year, and we see that some receivers got up to 50,000 detections. And bearing in mind that here we actually had to swap receivers in and out, we had in excess of about 200,000 detections in a really small area within the course of the year. Detections all up in the Sound and Mull and just the area off Morven, but far fewer. To turn that into a kind of detection plot for the females, we can see over the course of the year some females had incredibly high residency. They barely moved away from, receiver units. Other females seem to have almost like a seasonal movement where they're present over the winter and then in the summer they seem to move out. What we didn't really get with the females, except one of them, was the movement out over the summer and a return in the winter. However, if we look at the male plots, we see a much different story for the Firth of Lorne. We see far fewer detections and also much less seasonality. With the males tagged, we had to do 2 tagging episodes for the males because you caught so few in the first episode, we had to go back out to try and get some more data. Unfortunately, the weather didn't allow us to get out for quite a while, so there's a bit of a gap in the data. But we did get animals staying initially after tagging, but we got very few moving away and coming back. If we look at the number of days detected between males and females, you can see that females far outweigh the males. Obviously, there's a bit of a bifactor in the fact a few more females were tagged, but generally speaking, the females seem to make much more use of the Firth of Lorne than the males did. The archival tags I mentioned. Archival tags in general can record depth, temperature, light levels, acceleration, even magnetic fields now, but we stuck to depth and temperature. Because the animals are skate, we can assume they spend most of the time near the seafloor, and depth's actually a really useful variable for trying to look at movements. The problem with archival tags is that unlike the acoustic tags where you just have to pull the receiver out of the water to download the data, the archival tags must be recaptured to get the data. But because of that high recapture rate in the Firth of Lorne, we actually have 23, we have half the tags back that we put out from the double tagged fish. Just to have a look, going through these in brief, just to summarise some of the data we have. I mentioned the stunted tail earlier. You can see this one's probably lost about 10 inches off the tip of its tail. It's got no residual dorsal fins left, they've gone. But this was a large female who spent most of the time around the Firth of Lorne area between Loch Spelvey and South Kerrer. And we have archival records back for this one as well. So we have a full year of archival data with depth and temperature. We can see a few little spikes in the temperature data. This is actually when the animal was recaptured. So as well as this, we actually have recapture events from this skate to pinpoint its location exactly. And here we have the detection plot for it. So we can see that it spent most of its time within range of an acoustic receiver. This is actually incredible data, and you'll see why hopefully a little near the end of the talk when we take into account some environmental variables as well. Another female, this one's actually quite a bit smaller, but again we can see heavy use of this area around the Firth of between Mull and South Kerrer in the Firth of Lorne with 20,000 detections. Again, we have the full year of archival data with the high detection rate. This one didn't get recaptured at all, so there was no spikes in the temperature data. But again, really nice records of the spatial use of this animal in depth, and also with the acoustic, we have geolocation as well. Looking at the males now, this is a large male, but instantly the numbers drop down to 1,500 detections. Full year's worth of data from the depth and the temperature, but much sparser acoustic detection rate with a huge gap over the summer. Even just eyeballing these depth records for these fish, we can begin to see patterns. This male was a huge male that we captured, and it only had detections for the first 7 days of its deployment. So we don't know where this went, but it went down to 300 metres at one point. This depth record differs from the other ones a little bit. I was talking about patterns. So if we have the 2 females, the male with the seasonal residency and the male that disappeared. The 3 animals that showed a reasonable amount of detection rate in the MPA all have this unusual depth patterning over the summer where they seem to restrict or limit their vertical movements. The male that had very few detections with the deep water at 300 metres suggesting it maybe went somewhere else is much more open in its vertical distribution. But again, over the summer, there seems to be something, we believe it's temperature driven, that suppresses vertical movement. And in the winter, when the thermoclines break down, we think they can move throughout the ocean waters, making use of the surface waters. A big surprise to us was how much time they spent in water about 20 metres deep. For some of the females, the average depth over January and February was only 50 metres. They spend an awful lot of time in shallow waters, which for something that we normally consider a deep water species does movements off shelf down to about 600 metres. This was actually quite a big surprise. So just to summarise the data from the MPA is we know that females make They show much higher residency, much stronger site fidelity to that area. The males do tend to move in and out, but with some seasonality. Over the summer, they seem to have this restricted habitat preference to deep water. But that seasonal change in depth use maybe means that we have management opportunities, that we can look at seasonal management of this species to maximise the efficiency of the MPA while maximising the areas that the fishermen can use. So everybody kind of wins in that scenario. At the moment, we're only tagging the large skate because they're the ones that we can most frequently get hold of. I showed you a picture of the small skate, a couple of months old. That was caught in the MPA, but so far it's the only individual of that size we've caught, and we're desperately trying to find more so we can understand how these movements change over the life history of the skate. If we look back to this double tag, the double tagging of the animal, the reason that this seemed to be such a useful technique and the reason we're really excited about this data is that, as you saw from those detection plots, we have some animals that spend an awful lot of time in this array. So if they're detecting down here, we know they're in that area, and then we know they're in other receivers as they detect. Luckily, some lovely people at SAMS have been doing an awful lot of work in the Firth of Lorne to get high-resolution bathymetry data as part of various projects with John Howe and others. You have Dima here and others who've been creating models, oceanographic models with temperature, salinity, tidal flow. So we actually have a 4D environment for this species in this area. And that's a really good opportunity to maybe look at some fine-scale modelling. So the work we're looking at the moment takes the acoustic data. If we just take some detections from this array in the south for a minute, overlay the position of the acoustic receivers on what we know of the bathymetry. Now, as I said, the detection range for these receivers is approximately 500 metres, so that we have a buffer range of where the fish will have been. This has been tested extensively, so we know the maximum range of detection. Some cases it was 750 metres. I've actually put a buffer range on that of 1 kilometre just to maximise the sort of impact of this work, just to give you a demonstration. So that's the acoustic range, and if we go back to archival data and the acoustic data, and we just focus in on this area here, we have lots of detection plots, so we know the fish was near those receivers. We have this archival data with a kind of hard line at approximately, let's say, 160 metres. So if we start to use buffering and querying to look at the areas of 160 metres within the detection range of those receiver units, we actually see we've got an incredibly small amount of habitat available to the skate at the time that that data was collected. And what we hope to do is build up movement models of where the animal could have been based on the bathymetry, the acoustic data and the archival data. And then working with people here, we're going to try and build in some environmental variables to see what's driving those movements. What's the seasonality of those movements? Is it temperature in the water column? Do they use the tidal movement to move around the area, almost kiting in the tidal currents? This would be a really great opportunity for a fully aquatic animal. These kind of models normally exist only in the terrestrial environment just due to data paucity, and I'm really hopeful that here we have a unique case of almost like data richness. We just need to run to catch up with the amount of data by trying to create suitable models to actually incorporate all that. However, that's not the end of the story, because building on the tagging work, we are now undertaking a new acoustic project, slightly fewer receivers, but the tags we're using now are surgically implanted to prevent any surface irritation. The battery life for these tags is 10 years, so we're hoping to build up an idea of movement over the next 10 years. It was a slight plug by me. I figured the longer I made the tags last, the longer people would have to employ me to go out and get the data, but I don't know if that's going to pay off yet. There's also a fantastic photo identification project on the skate, the spot patterns on the dorsal surface. That's actually headed up by Stephen here at SAMS. So to have that on the doorstep knowledge working with these skate is a fantastic opportunity, because the thing is, with the invention of smartphones, I'm sure this is relevant to many other species, but anglers love their trophy shots. If we can get them to take the right trophy shots and submit them, we can actually uniquely identify each individual animal from the dorsal spot patterns. And that's what Stephen's working on at the moment with Clive and some others here. The external tags, as I mentioned, can get pulled off. They shed naturally. That's a bit of a problem when you're trying to work out population estimates. So if we replace the external tags with PIT tags, passive integrated transponder tags. If you never used them before, these are the same identifying chips that you put in cats and dogs. Slight drawback is anyone working with these needs a scanner, but we're working with the local charter skippers who all have individual hand scanners, and the data from this is phenomenal. So if we look back between 1970 to 2000 with the external tags, we had 3,000 fish. Over the course of 30 years, we had a record of one animal called Yo-Yo that was caught 10 times. And we thought this was amazing, 10 times in 30 years, that's incredible. From the PIT tagging, we have more than 3 or 4 animals that have been caught 10 times. We have one female at 14 times in 2 years, and we have one male at 12 times in that 2 years. And because of the PIT tagging has just opened up a whole new idea of the actual residency and site fidelity that the original mark and recapture data just couldn't show us. And what's really going to be exciting is when we've got animals that have PIT tags and photographs, and we can tie it together so it's like a cross-validation method, and we can really begin to do some really nice mark and recapture data analysis, which thus far has been hugely complicated by the angler effort, tag removal, and other complications. There's also a huge genetics program with this, and we've moved far beyond the sort of standard population genetics. Is this animal connected to other areas? To the point where we're actually trying to look at kinship relationships. We're looking at gene expression with animals that are transient versus resident. This is headed up by Kath Jones and Les Noble at Aberdeen and Nord University. And coming back to SAMS, we are also, well, it's a great opportunity for me to play with some fancy toys using AUVs to actually actively track the animals. The big problem with a static acoustic array is it's static and it's within the MPA boundaries. If we want to test the boundaries to see how the skate moving out, we have to send receivers out there. And it looks something like an automated underwater vehicle with a receiver literally duct taped to it might be the way forward for that. We can be big transect missions. Thus far, the weather seems to have been against me for this, but it's hopefully something we'll keep trying. So this is built up over the last 40 years, which started off as one guy who came out here and said, you know what, we need some data on skate. And he started putting these tags out on them. And it's just snowballed to within the last few years. We had a working group meeting the other day at the Masts ASM. We had nearly 20 people sat in the room, which coming from that one person 40 years ago, it's just fantastic to see. And we've got such a wide range of disciplines now. For me, we're really on the verge of having this amazing, quite holistic understanding of a marine species. And when you add into that all the stakeholder involvement from the anglers, the creel fishermen absolutely love it because it's kept all the mobile gear out of some of their favourite prawn grounds. And even the commercial fishermen, they don't want to catch these animals. They are hard to handle. There's quite a big penalty if they're seen to be interfering with them. So they're actually working with us now in ways to handle the skate properly and return them as effectively as possible. So for me, the skate is actually one of the success stories from that population decline and local extinction. And I'm not saying this is based purely on the protected area, but the skate species are now pushing, the flapper skate is now pushing back into its former habitat. It is being caught in the Irish Sea. It is being caught in parts of the North Sea. And hopefully there's a signs that this population is on its way to recovery. So for me, this is one of the big success stories of the marine environment. There's many others, I'm aware, but for me, this is something I've been involved with for 10 years now, and to have seen it develop to the stage we're at now is just fantastic. Kept it brief, I hope, didn't keep you for your whole lunch. There's obviously many partners involved with this. Marine Scotland and Scottish Natural Heritage have been fundamental in funding the work and driving the work at various stages. Obviously, the sea anglers, the Scottish Sea Angling Conservation Network who run the tagging programme have been great. Guys here at SAMS, Clive, Stephen, John and others, Colin and Karen. It's a really nice team to be involved in, and it's really great to work. And as I said, I really enjoy coming here to talk to you because I feel I spend all my time working on your doorstep, and it's great to actually be in and talking to you about this. Happy to take questions, happy to talk to anyone about specific aspects from sort of tagging, the animal welfare aspect, all the way through to perhaps marine protected areas for mobile species. My email address is up there. Please email me any questions at all. If anyone has ideas for, you know, I put up that idea is we're trying to model this data. What I really meant is I'm sat scratching my head trying to work out how I'm going to model this data. So if people have any ideas, I'd be delighted to talk to you. Other things I know, I spoke to Kim at the Mast ASM. We're going to try and put a tidal flow down on the anchor chain so we can see time of day caught with the skate against water speed. little opportunities like that can actually quickly add quite a lot of data to a project like this. So I'd be really excited and happy to talk to any of you if you have any ideas for similar opportunities. And with that, thank you very much.